This is an interview with Arnold Judson, MIT class of 1947. It's April 25th, 2008. I'm Forrest Larson in the MIT Lewis Music Library. It's my pleasure to welcome back for a second interview Arnold Judson. He received 2 degrees from MIT, a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering in 1947 and a master's degree in organizational behavior in 1948. I'm Forrest Larson. It's April 25th, 2008. We're in the MIT Music Library.
Okay, just one quick correction. The master's degree was officially called Economics and Engineering.
Oh.
Because organizational behavior was a term that wasn't invented until several years afterwards. But that's what it was. It was organizational behavior, and that whole field was really invented at MIT. That was the program. That was the very first graduate program in organizational behavior that I know of in this country or anywhere.
Wow, that's very interesting.
I mean, that whole story is, it's aside from this, it's a very fascinating story. And it was really because of the humanities that I got into this program. This is a very interesting.
Right, and you got into some of that in the previous interview about how you got into that with there was that psychology professor that
McGregor.
Yeah, who was really helpful to you. Just a little bit of background information about the humanities at MIT at that time. When you were a student in the late 1940s, there was a division of humanities, and someone named Robert Caldwell was Dean of Humanities. There was a Department of English and History and a Department of Social Sciences within the division of humanities. And Professor Klaus Liebman, the first professor of music, was in the Department of English and History. Interesting enough.
Well, that was at the very end of my undergraduate.
Right.
Well, actually, it wasn't. It was after my undergraduate degree.
Okay. Well, as of 1949, and prior to that, there was the Division of Humanities.
Yeah. But I'm not sure whether it was. I started here in 1943.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what the status of it was then.
I'm not sure how far back. I don't have the date right with me, but it certainly predates. It didn't start in 1949, but when I've been looking at course catalogs and some stuff written actually by Dean Caldwell from that time. So I don't have
that name doesn't ring any bell with me at all.
Okay.
And all of my first contact with humanities courses were as electives in 1943 and 44 and 45.
Right. And they were all electives. There was no humanities degree offered, not until the School of Humanities and Social Sciences started in 1950, which there was, Okay, so I wanted to ask you about the arts and humanities and social sciences at MIT. In the previous interview, you had mentioned the importance of humanities courses you took as an undergraduate, and you specifically mentioned William Green, professor of English, George de Santillana, professor of history of science, and the psychology.
He taught philosophy, history of philosophy.
Right, but he's listed in the course catalog as professor of history of science, which obviously includes history of philosophy. You can't have. And then there's the psychology.
Carl Deutsch is another one.
Okay. All right.
He was also like the son. He taught the second semester of the history of philosophy, but he was in economics. History of economics and economic philosophy.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the history of philosophy courses and just what?
Well, it was a 2-semester course, and I loved it. I mean, it really turned me on, the whole. I never took anything with Green. I knew him, but I had frequent contact with him.
Okay.
But I never actually took any course with him. And I don't remember there was a freshman English course which I took, which Green was part of that group, and I don't remember who taught that, and that was kind of basically a writing course.
Mm-hmm.
But the really meaty stuff started in my sophomore year, which was the 2 philosophy courses. First semester was Sandeliana, and the second semester was Deutsch. And then in my third year, it was I took an economics course with George Schultz.
No kidding.
Yeah,
Our
he was, and a psychology course with McGregor.
Wow. So the history of philosophy courses, were there particular ideas or thinkers that you got familiar with that have kind of stayed with you?
It was just all new stuff to me. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I did a lot of reading and
Mm-hmm.
extensive reading, and both de Sandeliana and Deutsch were inspiring professors, and it was a small, it wasn't a big lecture course. It was a small class, so it was a very intimate kind of situation, and quite unlike anything I'd ever had before, and it was a great relief from my technical courses.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the reason I was attracted to this mysterious graduate program that I got into, the organizational behavior thing, I mean, they didn't even know how to describe it. It was I call it mysterious because it had no real name, and they only accepted, I think there were only 12 of us in this program, 12 or 14, something like that. And it was sort of presented as an attempt to integrate economics, industrial relations, and social sciences. I mean, very mushy. And but the reason I was attracted to it was that McGregor was running it, and Deutsch was involved in it, and a couple of other people whom I'd had. Oh, another thing too is I used to hang out. There was a small group of us that used to sort of hang out in Norbert Wiener's office and talk about all kinds of stuff. And as some of the other people in the math department I was kind of a hanger-on to as well. I mean, I was a commuter, and I did all my studying here, mostly in the music library, all my homework and everything. And so I used to hang, I was here from like 8:15 in the morning to often till 10 o'clock at night. And I was very involved in a number of extracurricular things, like the Glee Club and D-Tech,
right,
in particular. Those are the two kind of time-consuming, and the orchestra later.
Right.
And so I was around, all day. And so I had opportunities to sort of hang out in various places. And so there was a sort of a funny little group that was attached to Norbert Wiener. Oliver Selfridge, is that a name that rings any bell?
I've seen the name someplace.
Yeah.
Didn't he write some lyrics for a show that you had done?
No.
No.
Maybe
there was a thing called the town the Concord Town Meeting or something. There was a name.
Oh no, that was a show that my wife and I did.
But
later.
there was a Selfridge. There was a name. It said "O Selfridge" on that.
Oh, that is, yeah. I guess it is Oliver Selfridge. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Oh, that's right too. Yes, because I encountered him later on. He was a resident in the town of Lincoln, I think.
Okay, it was the Lincoln Town Meeting, not Concord.
Yeah. Right.
Okay.
Yeah. But I mean, I first met him as one of the little group of hangers-on with Norbert Wiener. Another guy was Wally Pitts. I don't know. It was a very. These were all sort of boy genius types. Were attracted to mathematics, especially. But we were also. I mean, one of the. That was, when the bomb was dropped and the Manhattan Project became known. This was in my senior year. And Wiener was very vocal about being anti-nuclear. I mean, he was probably one of the pioneers in the anti-nuclear movement. And it was very unfashionable to be anti-nuclear in those days. So that was a subject of considerable discussion at the time.
Wow. Wow.
So we were into politics and, you know, all kinds of stuff. And so I really had a very lively, varied group of contacts and so on while I was here as an undergraduate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that continued as in the graduate program.
So MIT's...
So anyway, the bottom line was that it was the humanities really that was instrumental in undermining my commitment to become an engineer. So, and you know, and in my senior year is when I met my wife, and her father was a doctor, general practitioner, but he was also had just come out of the Navy in World War II, where he had done neurology and was transitioning to psychiatry. And so he was very involved. Well, Boston was a very lively scene of psychoanalysis. There was a big group of psychoanalysts in Boston, and there was a number of very fascinating lectures which were sponsored by the Boston Psychoanalytic Institute by leading psychoanalysts and psychiatrists in the area. And my father-in-law, to be, schlepped me with him to attend these lectures, which coincided. This is when I was in graduate school, and when I was beginning to go to graduate school, and it really reinforced my change of orientation from engineering to organizational behavior.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. MIT's core educational mission has always been a science engineering-based curriculum, but it's never been strictly a technical school. But for a while it had narrowed its curriculum where it was mostly an engineering school, even neglecting pure sciences. But it was President Carl Compton, who broadened the humanities program, but also added more pure science courses and included more pure scientific research. I find that fascinating. But over the years, the humanities and arts programs have expanded, but still MIT has maintained the science engineering kind of core curriculum. From your experience as a student and some of the things you were just talking about now in your professional career in business management and consulting, and also your continued life in music, looking back, how do you see the arts and humanities at MIT as it is in a school that has a science-based curriculum? Do you have any comments about that? I know that's a big subject, and that's kind of a hard one. But do you have any comments about that?
Well, I think it's an absolutely vital piece of the whole MIT curriculum. And I'm kind of prejudiced because my wife is on the MIT Council for the Arts, and she's been on it for like 12 years. And she was recruited at my 50th reunion, and because she was in the theater, and so they wanted somebody with her kind of background on the council, and through her activities, contemporary activities on the council, it's very clear that there are a lot of students whose life has been saved by the arts program here, because they have these varied interests, and that's an outlet for these interests, and it's a terrific counterbalance to the technical stuff.
Right.
And I originally, when I first came here, thought I wanted to be an aeronautical engineer, and the initial freshman program was uniform for everybody, and I found in the first semester of my sophomore year that the courses that really turned me off completely were the kind of nuts and bolts courses which were crucial to traditional engineering, like aeronautical engineering, like strength of materials, for example. Boring, absolutely boring. It's all rotes, formula crap, and I couldn't stand it. And so that's when I decided that I really didn't want to be an aeronautical engineer, and chemical engineering appealed to me because it was more mysterious. It had all of these processes that you couldn't see, and you had to sort of theorize about what was going on. And you knew what was going in, and you knew what came out, but you didn't know what the hell was going on in between. And the courses, the exams in chemical engineering were much more challenging because they marked you in those days, probably still do, on your thought processes and method rather than on the answer, which is totally different from mechanical engineering, or as it was then. Or no. So I was very happy with the shift to chemical engineering. And then in my junior year, when you got very serious about the chemical engineering courses, I got exposed to a professor of colloidal chemistry named Hauser, who was a real character.
What was his first name?
Ernst Hauser. He's a German. And colloidal chemistry kind of appealed to me even more because it was even more mysterious than, there was all kinds of weird things going on. So that was sort of captured my interest, but all the other stuff I was doing here that had nothing to do with technical stuff was even more interesting to me. And so that's what kind of, and then what happens, I was here I finished my junior year in 2 years because there was no vacations just during the war, and so I never had a chance to think about anything. I was just doing all the time. And then, happily, I got into the Navy, and this was. Did I cover this before?
Some of it, yeah.
Because I don't want to repeat myself. But anyway, the Navy, going into the Navy was a blessing because it was an enforced vacation from here. And I had a chance to sort of reflect about a lot of stuff. And when I came back to MIT on the GI Bill, after I was only in the Navy for a year because they dropped the bomb right after I finished boot camp, and I was supposed to get a year's training in radar technician stuff, and they can't. They offered deals to cancel the contract.
Wow. When
they dropped the bomb, because they were committed to giving me this year's program, and they didn't need to do it anymore. So the contract, the deal that I finally had was to get sent to a separation center nearest my home for duty until discharge. That was the so I got sent to the Fargo building, and I did some real crap there for a little while, and then I got transferred to Quonset Point, Rhode Island, where I sort of finished off my year in the Navy. A lot of the time there I spent sailing boats, which I learned how to do on Charles River. But anyway, that was my sea duty. But when I came back, the idea of becoming an engineer suddenly lost its appeal completely. And I hadn't really thought about it. It was just sort of an unconscious process. And I really didn't know what the hell I wanted to do. And all of a sudden, I heard rumors about this new graduate program in organizational behavior, and because of the people who were associated with it and the kinds of stuff that was involved, which I really didn't know much about, but it all sounded a lot better than engineering, and it all sort of fit the kind of trajectory I was unconsciously moving toward.
Mm-hmm.
And all of that was really fueled by my interest in the humanities and all the extracurricular stuff I was doing here.
Right.
So that's, and none of this would have happened if they didn't have a good humanities program.
That's amazing. Yeah.
So.
When you were a student in the late 40s, do you recall kind of fellow students' views about particularly the arts and the music that was going on? Was there what was the?
Well, I mean, my buddies were all people who were like-minded, and,
Mm-hmm.
and they all of them were unhappy campers from a point of view of traditional engineering.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for example, the president of my class, Norm Holland, who was in electrical engineering, and he had probably some of the best marks in his class, but he was a writer and a poet, and he was only here at MIT because his father was a patent attorney and was forcing him to follow in his footsteps, which he didn't want to do, but he did. And so what happened to him was, I think, very revealing. I mean, he got his degree in electrical engineering. He was accepted to Harvard Law School, and he got his lawyer's degree, and he became a patent attorney for just long enough to save up some money to go back to graduate school at Harvard, where he got a PhD in literature. And he's become a very distinguished professor of literature ever since.
Mm-hmm.
And he ran a very, very popular, successful program in the 50s called the Shakespearean Imagination on WGBH, and this was in the very early days. And he hired my wife to act in a few illustrative scenes which he had on this program. He used to get fan mail from all kinds of people. It was unbelievable. And he wrote some pioneering works in analysis of Shakespearean characters. He was psychoanalyzed also, and so he had a very psychoanalytic point of view in terms of character, Shakespearean characters. But he was one of my best friends here, and a lot of my other friends were also heavily into non-technical stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the guy who wrote the lyrics to the Tech Show, Jack Kiefer, was also very interested in writing, and he was here mainly because his parents pressured him into becoming learning a trade, that kind of thing. But he wouldn't have been here otherwise.
What did he go on to do professionally after? Did he?
I don't really know. He died fairly young, so I don't remember. I didn't really maintain contact. Well, one of my other very good friends, however, whom I'm still very good friends with, got a PhD in mechanical engineering finally, but he was heavily into music, but not from a performing point of view, just from an appreciation point of view.
What was his name?
Fred Eric.
Uh-huh.
And he's still got a faculty appointment here.
Wow.
And,
the MIT Tech newspaper, May 2nd, 1947, had an article, and it mentions the formation of a new student organization called the MIT Liberal Arts Society, and their purpose was to publish a literary magazine.
Oh.
Did you know about that?
I don't remember really.
Uh-huh. Yeah. I wondered if anything came of it, I haven't had a chance to see
Well,
if there's
probably
any.
Norm Holland must have been involved in that,
Uh-huh.
because I would imagine he would have been a seminal figure in that.
Mhm. There seemed to be something in the air on campus. Lots of discussions of articles in the MIT Tech newspaper, editorials concerning the liberal arts, even Technology Review, MIT's
Yeah.
magazine. There were articles about the need for the humanities.
Well, it was real ferment in that, because the
Yeah.
subject of a liberal life was all
right.
that,
That's
all,
the right.
and that didn't come out of nowhere. I mean, that was Kiefer's idea. I mean, he wrote the
Right.
libretto,
Right.
and so that was emblematic, I think, of
Right.
what was going
There was a
on.
lot of that going on. And,
Yeah.
So we'll get more into the 47 Tech Show, as you said. It's,
Well, and there was some funny crossovers that kept happening. I went to a performance of R.U.R. by the play by Karl Čapek, about robots. That was the original play, and Norbert Wiener appeared on stage before and demonstrated a little robot that he was manipulating with an antenna-driven device.
My goodness.
And I mean, it was, and this was not an MIT production. This was some theater company in Boston that did it, but somehow they got Norbert involved in it. And
my goodness.
yeah,
Wow. So to move on to another subject, music in Boston in the 1940s and 50s, it was a really interesting time for not only Boston but the country at large. Serge Kuzovitsky was still conducting.
Right.
He finished in 1949, and then Charles Munch, 1949 through 61.
right.
Kuzovitsky's strong advocacy of American and Boston area composers such as Walter Piston was significant.
Right.
This really challenged the predominant view that classical music can only be composed by Europeans from Germany, France, and Italy.
Yeah.
He also gave performances of important European works as well. As we talked about in your last interview, you had studied with Walter Piston. In the classes, was the subject of American classical music discussed, this whole issue? Because it still seemed to be somewhat of a kind of a radical idea about classical music by Americans. Was that discussed?
No, this course that I took with Piston was very focused. I mean, all we did was we wrote things, brought it into class, listened to it, and commented on it.
Right. I just wondered if, just in the course of conversation, if these things came up, maybe not as an official.
No, it did. It was never. I think it was sort of taken for granted. This was 1948 that I took this thing with Piston,
right.
And I think it was taken. It was already apparent that there was some pretty good American music being written and played, and so I don't think it was a cause anymore at that point.
Because among music critics, it was still controversial.
Oh well, music critics.
It was still a big deal, and Kuzovitsky ran into lots of problems, even with programming stuff at the BSO. And there was a lot of pushback. When you're kind of involved in a scene like that, you, as you said, it was just kind of taken for granted. But I just wondered, that in itself is interesting.
There was a small group of us that went regularly to the BSO Friday afternoon concerts. Rush, we would wait in line and go.
Right.
And so that's when we heard all this stuff, and it was a very exciting. I mean, we did this for several years, and this is when I heard the Bartok premiere and lots of other premieres. Mark Blitstein's Airborne Symphony.
Wow.
Which is.
Did you get a sense that that classical music was changing? Did you kind of think of it in that way, or when you were hearing some of this new American works that were quite different from the European tradition, were you consciously thinking American classical music is changing the?
Well, I was already attuned to that because I'd heard a lot of this stuff on records here at the library.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, there were a few people that really sort of grabbed me. Roy Harris was one.
Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of premieres at the BSO did of his work.
Yeah. And I mean, he had a very distinctive sound, and American, like Copeland.
Right.
And the thing another experience which I had earlier, which really was an eye-opener, was I went to On the Town by Bernstein. This is when I was still in the Navy, and I was on leave when I got into this, the opening. I mean, not the very opening, but I mean, it was the opening run.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a revelatory experience because it was very different from the kind of more traditional musicals which had preceded it.
Right.
And it was a very fresh and exciting kind of sound. And that influenced the liberal life a lot.
Right. And you were saying that in earlier conversations that it was some of the jazz elements of that.
Yeah. Well, it was the jazz elements.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We'll get more into that subject in just a little bit. Were you at the Boston Symphony premiere of the Copeland Third Symphony in 1946?
I think so.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I think I was. Yeah.
What about some of the premieres of some of the Walter Piston symphonies?
Yeah, I think I heard.
Do you have any comments about kind of being at the BSO for some of those premieres? I don't know.
I mean,
yeah.
There were not too many that really kind of stood out as. Another one that really grabbed me was the Honegger String Symphony.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. With with the three trumpets coming in at the very end.
Right.
Yeah. And I really like that a lot. And
so, when you had mentioned you being at the premiere of the Bartók Concerto for Orchestra in 1944, was that seen kind of locally as a big event? Were people kind of talking about it, or was this just another premiere of another?
I think it was at the time. It was just another premiere.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned just a little bit ago, you got familiar with a lot of contemporary music here at the MIT Music Library. Right. Besides going to hear new works at the Boston Symphony, were there other local venues for hearing new music that you recall or that you went to?
Well, I wasn't particularly, at that point, I wasn't that taken with chamber music. That came later. I was really pretty much focused on symphonic stuff while I was here, and symphonic stuff and choral and some choral stuff too, but big scale stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that's the immaturity of youth. But and my time availability, the time that I had to do this kind of stuff was still pretty limited because I was heavily still a student and doing all this other stuff.
Right.
And also didn't have much money, so I had to limit what I did to carefully selected events. That was so in the 40s. It was the BSO was really kind of the main scene.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that you have a keen interest in jazz. When did that come about, and how did that come about?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I mean, it developed while I was also while I was at MIT, but I don't know how it started.
Were there any jazz records in the music library at the time?
I don't remember. I don't think so.
Uh-huh.
But I mean, I don't recall sort of listening to jazz here in the library. I think I really got interested in jazz when I was dating with my wife and to-be. And we used to go a lot to hear live jazz. And there were lots of places in Boston. Well, not lots of places, but there were a few very good places. The Savoy, we used to go to the Savoy a lot.
Right, you've mentioned that.
Yeah,
So.
and that was mostly at that time traditional jazz. I mean, New Orleans.
Right,
stuff.
like Sidney Bechet. He
Yes,
did a long run there. As a,
right.
Yeah.
He was there like almost a year.
Right.
And then I started. It was mostly but then we also there was also some other places where we heard Dave Brubeck at a very early stage, and that was an exciting experience. And there was a place in Kenmore Square where he appeared. It was a very sparsely filled room.
Do you remember what the place was called?
It was where the Brunswick, the corner of where Brookline Avenue goes up, right on the corner there.
Oh,
And there was a jazz place there.
Wow. I'll have to look up and see what the name of that place might be.
And then the interest in jazz really started then. It started in the late 40s, and then I started buying records like crazy. And at a pretty early stage, I got turned on to Thelonious Monk, which was like a revelatory experience. And the Modern Jazz Quartet. And we went to one of the first Newport, I think the second Newport Jazz Festival. But that's late, that's in 55, I think it was. And we met Dizzy Gillespie and had a chance to have a little interchange with him.
Wow.
And also Monk was there.
Wow. Did you talk at all with Monk?
Well, one doesn't talk to him.
Yeah. He's a cryptic figure, but...
Yes, so it was. So the jazz, the major interest in jazz. Oh, and then I had a friend that when we moved to Concord in '55, we made friends with a guy who was a major jazz buff. He was a painter, and he painted jazz artists.
What was his name?
Dick Frenier. And he and my wife, he was a very good dancer, and they did a jazz a program called A History of Jazz Dance, in which they demonstrated stuff from the Turkey Trot onward, and I put together all the music and was the disc jockey and the narrator for this dance program.
Wow.
So.
Wow. You mentioned to me in a phone conversation about playing some what you called atonal jazz with a group called the Wreckers.
Oh yeah, it's a Polish group. Well, this was at the friend actually at this guy Frenier. They had sort of a lawn party. Most of the socializing that went on at that stage in our lives was going to other people's houses and dinner parties or lawn parties. You know, it was that kind of activity. And so he threw this party in which he got this Polish group that was happened to be touring in Boston at the time, and appeared, and so I had a chance to sit in with them. That was only a one-time experience. But I had another friend who was a sort of an amateur pianist, and we did four-handed improvised stuff, and that was a sort of atonal jazz.
With that, were you working from any charts or anything like that, or was it kind of more free jazz? The two piano stuff. Were you?
No. It was one piano, four hands.
Piano four. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, but were you working from charts, or were you?
No charts.
Yeah.
No, it was all off the top of the head.
Did you ever hear the Herb Pomeroy Orchestra?
Oh, sure.
You know that he taught here at MIT for from 1963 to 1985. He started the MIT Festival Jazz Ensemble.
Yeah. So, well, I was living in England at that time, so I didn't.
But you did.
But I knew him I had heard him before we moved to England. Yeah, he was a major figure in the Boston scene.
Yeah.
And we also know the Aardvark.
Yeah, Mark Harvey.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've gone to many of their concerts and actually been a recording engineer for some of their concerts and stuff like that. So, so you actually know Mark Harvey. That's great.
Yeah, actually, my wife knows him better than I do. She's had some involvement with. I've forgotten what the context was. But.
Wow. So to radically change the subject, or at least to some degree, in a previous phone conversation, you mentioned you had some thoughts on the music of Arnold Schoenberg and serialism. A little bit of kind of prefatory comments here. In your classes with Walter Piston, was the music of Schoenberg discussed at all? Did the students talk about it, or was that?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think anybody in the class was very gung-ho 12-tonal compositional style. I mean, and Piston certainly was not an enthusiastic supporter of that thing. So we really never got into it that I can recall.
So here's an interesting thing about Piston with 12-tone music. He had some reservations about 12-tone theory and serial theory, but he did write a few pieces actually using 12-tone technique. There's a variation movement of the partita for violin, viola, and organ, and another organ piece called Chromatic Study on the Name of Bach. It seemed like there's an article that he wrote called More Views on Serialism. It was from 1958. He seemed to have an open-minded attitude towards that.
He was a very eclectic in his... I mean, he didn't have any major... The only big prejudice he seemed to have that I can recall was that he was not at all keen about what he called extra musical ideas, namely tone poems, things with literary. So he was certainly not in favor of pursuing the Richard Strauss approach to composition. But that was the only thing I can remember that he really had some pretty strong views and against. And the 12-tone stuff never really came up in that context.
Just here's kind of quoting from his article. He said, his difficulty was not the systematic ordering of the 12 tones, rather it was a lack of perceived harmonic rhythm. And to quote him exactly, harmonic rhythm the rhythm of root change seems to be lost to the music of 12-tone technique. The constant presence of all 12 tones creates a motionless harmonic texture, just as it had previously did in styles of overdone chromaticism,
Yeah.
like Richard Strauss.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've never been a fan of 12-tone stuff, but my objection to it is based on the impact on the listener, and that is it's anxiety producing, I think, which and it never seems to go anywhere. You know, it one has the feeling that it's meandering, and I have that kind of feeling about other composers that preceded 12-tone, like Delius, for example, who was very meandering in his. But it's also Wagnerian. You know, the whole. This is all comes from Wagner, and I feel very strongly that the architectural element in music is a very important piece of what makes it a satisfying aesthetic experience. And if you destroy that, or replace it with something that has the effect of removing the feeling that you're going anywhere, you know, that you're just sort of aimlessly seeking. I mean, once in a while, you know, all right, I could see doing that. As an interesting essay in something different, but to make a whole, you know, make that everything you do is like that, I think is awful. And so I think it was a real disaster in terms of its impact on composition, and I think it's a dead end for that reason, and I think that's proven historically to be the case because, you know, I think the number of people who really are still practicing that have dwindled away. But it had a terrible effect on me. It really because for a lot of my when I was still actively writing stuff, it discouraged me because you know, everybody seemed to be hot about 12-tonal music, and it had an enormous appeal to academia and to grant writers and all of that kind of stuff, and I just sort of said, fuck it, you know. I didn't want to get into that.
There's so many composers like yourself who are devastated by that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Because I think, I mean, when all is said and done, I mean, music has to create in the listener a satisfying emotional experience, and if it isn't satisfying, what's the point?
Right.
I mean, you know, I have a fairly broad definition of what potentially is, you know, could be satisfying, but including some anxiety-producing segments. But, you know, you have to end up with a feeling that you've been on a voyage and you've, you know, been somewhere and ended up somewhere. And if that's been removed, what's the point?
So you mentioned Alban Berg, who was also a student of Schoenberg, but you mentioned that there's some pieces of Alban Berg that you liked. What's different about Berg's music that appeals to you that you're not finding in Schoenberg?
Well, he's an apostate 12-tonalist. he didn't stick to the religiously pure theory, and that's why I think his music is much more satisfying. I mean, it's emotionally often horrendously difficult, but it's powerful. I mean, Wojciech is a terrific opera.
Right.
And we saw a wonderful production of it by the Hamburg Opera Company when we lived in London. It was absolutely terrific experience.
Do you know the violin concerto?
And I love
Yeah.
the violin concerto.
Yeah.
That's another one.
Mm-hmm.
But there aren't that many. He didn't write that many things that are well known
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
or that often performed.
Right. Right. In a earlier phone conversation, you mentioned that you'd played some of the piano music of Henry Cowell. How much of his music did you get to know?
Well, I didn't play it. I didn't play
just,
it myself.
oh,
No.
You
On records.
Okay. Uh-huh.
Yeah, well, he's a lot of fun. I mean, there's a strong folk kind of element in his music. I don't know. He's sort of lost any popularity. I mean, he's sort of out of the picture now. I don't know.
He kind of comes and goes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Harrison is somebody I like.
Lou Harrison.
Lou Harrison, yeah.
Yeah, a wonderful composer.
Yeah.
Somebody who's dropped off the radar scope, but recently in the last few years is coming back again, is somebody named Leo Ornstein. Were you familiar?
Yeah, I've heard, not very familiar. I've heard a little bit of it. He was early. I mean,
that's right.
He was sort of turn of the century.
Right. He lived till he was 105 or something like that. He just died a few years ago.
Really?
But it was after the 1930s. He just kind of dropped off the scene.
Yeah.
But there's a new biography out of him, and I just have heard some recent performances of his music, and just wondered if, at your time, if you had known any of his music. Somebody during your particularly your student days who wasn't particularly well known, but has gone on. His star continues to rise. The music of Charles Ives.
I love Ives. I think he's great. Well, Ives, was sort of a hero of mine because he was like me, was not a professional. I mean, that was not his major.
Right. He was in the insurance business. Yeah. Right.
And apparently he was very good at it too, which surprised me when I learned. I mean, he's certainly an oddball, unique, original voice.
What are some of the Ives pieces that you've particularly liked?
Well.
You know the Concord Sonata, the second piano sonata?
Yeah, I'm not too crazy about that, but I love his second and third symphonies.
Mm-hmm.
And some of his songs are wonderful. I love those songs.
Those are great. Did you ever play piano for a singer for any of the Ives songs? No. Is the music of Aaron Copland? Is there any? Is he somebody you're interested in? And
well, he's a lot more varied than I mean, his major populist stuff is very similar, but there are some other things that he's written which are much nuttier and
like the piano quintet.
Yeah,
that's actually
the piano sonata.
Yeah, right, and the piano variations.
Yeah.
And then there's a piano trio that uses quartertones.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know that piece or not.
And his earlier stuff that he wrote in the 20s, that organ, that symphony with organ.
That's right. Yeah. Right.
And there's sort of music for the theater.
And there's a solo organ piece that's really dissonant. It doesn't sound at all like the Copland of later years. I was quite surprised. It's a really good piece. You mentioned that you've played some George Gershwin. Which Gershwin pieces have you played?
Well, I played the Preludes, and I played the Concerto in F with an orchestra.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Do you remember which orchestra that was?
It was not...
was it here in Boston?
Yeah, I don't remember. I'm not sure it was ever. It was. I think we just did a bit of it. So it wasn't an official performance. But I did learn it, and I'm currently actually working on the solo piano version of the Rhapsody in Blue, which he did.
Wow.
Which was very
Wow.
Yeah. And then I love his show music. I mean, and he has written a number of kind of improvisations on his show stuff, which I think are his best things, really.
Yeah, I don't know much of those, other than there's a solo piano piece or a piano orchestra piece based upon "I Got Rhythm," which I heard recently.
Yeah, no, these are just for solo piano.
Yeah, right. I don't know those others. Have you played any ragtime?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Scott Joplin.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll enjoy that. A lot of fun.
So you mentioned being really inspired by hearing "On the Town" by Leonard Bernstein, and you said that the jazz elements really caught your eye. What was it about jazz that interested you to use some of those elements in your music? Can you talk about that? Because there's traces of that in your music, some jazz inspiration. There's that.
Well, the dance thing, Fixotropy, is very much.
Absolutely, yeah. We'll get more into that in a minute. Were there some other pieces that had a real direct
no, I don't think so.
influence?
No. But I enjoyed fooling around with improvisation and stuff, which I've done on and off, with or without audiences.
So just a couple more questions about your studies with Walter Piston. As a composer, his music is distinctive for its clarity of lines and textures and intricate counterpoint and vital rhythms. Were any of those things that you kind of took with you as a composer? Any values from that
Yeah, I think
you?
all of those things. I mean, I have always been attracted to music that had a strong structural element to it, and that's why Beethoven still remains my all-time favorite. I mean, it's hard to beat him in that regard. The whole economy of ideas. I mean, he does a lot with a little,
right?
And so does Stravinsky. I mean, that's another guy who I admire for not squandering the ideas, but doing a lot with a limited number of ideas.
And your music certainly shows that too. When you were taking these classes with Walter Piston, what pieces did you write? Do you remember?
Well, yeah. The first thing I wrote was a duet for trumpet and trombone.
I saw that in your manuscripts there.
And I got two guys to play it, and I brought it into class, and they did it live, which was fun. And it's a fairly craggy piece. And I also wrote a sonata for trumpet and piano, which at that time, I don't think, I'm trying to remember what else. So maybe some songs and stuff.
Who was the trumpet player for the sonata? Was it somebody in the class?
No. Marty Lessett was his name,
Uh-huh.
and he was a professional trumpet player. I think he was. I found him at the conservatory. He was in the conservatory orchestra.
How about the trombonist for the trumpet and trombone piece?
Yeah, I don't remember who I got for that.
Uh-huh.
I think Marty found him. I sort of relied on him to find the trombonist.
Mm-hmm. Your orchestra piece, Prelude and Allegro. Did you work with Piston at all on that?
No, that was
after that. Did you write any orchestra pieces while you were taking the classes with?
No,
Piston?
They were all limited, small scale stuff.
So that Prelude and Allegro, that's your first kind of solo orchestra piece.
Yeah, I think that's really the only full orchestra thing that I wrote that was completed. I started a number of things, but I never. But I gravitated toward dance and theater stuff because I knew it would be performed. Even if I had to do it find instrumentalists myself and conduct them, which I often did. But to find, to get other people to play my stuff, I remember having a meeting with Lucas Foss at one point, where he was I've forgotten what his role was at the time at the BSO, but I got an interview with him.
He was a pianist with them.
Yeah, he was the pianist, but I mean later he had some other role. And I had I was trying to find somebody who might be interested in performing some stuff I wrote, and it was very discouraging in terms of getting anybody to even think about looking at it seriously. He talked about piles of stuff that people send him and never gets to see any of it. So it was really that sort of got me to search for another way of hearing what I've written, because you don't learn anything unless you hear it. It doesn't necessarily match what you think it's going to sound like on paper until you hear it.
Right.
And so I got involved with I first got involved with a dancer who was a choreographer, and in where we lived in Concord, and she and I collaborated on.
That was Martha Beard, right?
No. This is before Martha.
Oh.
Martin, her name was Carolee Martin, and I wrote this thing called "Leaving Behind Him," which was for cello and piano, and that was done. She was a modern dance Martha Graham type. That was done on on television, GBH, I guess it was. And I was interviewed by somebody, and it was a whole big deal. But it was nice. It was fun, and that kind of got me more and more interested in dance. And I spent 2 summers. This was in the 50s, working as a rehearsal pianist on a volunteer basis with 2 Martha Graham stars who came to Boston and gave a summer seminar in jazz dance, and I sort of improvised while they did their thing in the class. And I did that to sort of learn more about choreography and dance and so on. And it was a very useful experience. And there was a very lively dance scene in Boston at the time, and they forgotten what the name of the dance. It wasn't the Dance Collective. It was something like that got the Graham Company to send these 2 people. Not at the same time. One came one summer, and the other person came the following summer, and I got involved with that. and that's then the Martha Baird thing sort of grew out of that as well.
I wondered how that.
And the lead dancer was Gus Solomons, who was an MIT.
Right, class of 1961.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. And he had subsequently had his own company. I just bumped into him recently
Wow.
at a cultural council event.
Right. Just a couple more kind of technical things about your own music. Looking at some of your scores, a lot of the pieces don't have key signatures, but your harmonies are still based upon thirds. There are some dissonant passages, but overall it's consonant. If you want to kind of roughly summarize it, talk about how you think about harmony and kind of how you're using harmony.
Well, I would I think there was, I would characterize it as polytonal for the most part. I never got hooked on key signatures particularly. But I also, in my education in music was so disorganized in a way. I started out just being a piano student and performing, and for most of that time, I really didn't learn much about music theory at all. And then toward the end of this, I'm talking about when I was a kid. I was just taking lessons from a piano teacher, and but we never really talked about theory at all. But toward the end of that, I did take a course in harmony privately with a guy.
Who was that?
Well, this was somebody in Brockton who was named Dominic Procopio was his name. Very nice guy, and I also took a course in. That was hard. Yeah, harmony really was and that's about the only formal training I had before studying with Piston. The fact that he accepted me was astonishing because I was really not particularly well prepared. Then subsequently, I had this after Piston. I don't know if I mentioned this. My wife was at Brown, and we got married between a junior and senior year, and I used to hang out at the music department at Brown, and they assumed I was a registered student, so I took courses. And I took a counterpoint course there, which was the first time I'd done that. And but I did a lot of reading. I read Piston's books on harmony and counterpoint. But it was a very unorganized kind of training. But as a result of that, I never really thought about, the formal aspects. It was more by feel than by conscious theoretical preconceptions.
So the last interview
and what informed my approach to composition more than anything is music that I'd heard that I liked, and attempts to sort of emulate things that I found satisfying. So I would remember passages from Stravinsky or passages from Honegger or that kind of thing, and or Mahler or whatever, and I would try to do things that were in that spirit. That probably influenced me more than an attempt to have a preconceived theoretical concept, which I then tried to develop. Does that make any?
Sure,
Yeah.
absolutely. In the previous interview, we talked somewhat about your involvement with the 1947 Tech Show. I have some things that I was able to find some back issues of the MIT Tech that might jog some memory for you, and I would want to ask you about. The Tech Show had been defunct since 1931.
31?
That's what I'm finding in the research that I had done. That was the last that it had been done.
Oh, I thought I wasn't aware of that. I thought that it had just ceased during the war.
No.
But I thought that it was going on. Oh.
No.
Well, we decided to revive it. We being Jack Kiefer and myself.
Right.
We did, it was all our doing.
Right. There's an article, October 18th, 1946, in the Tech, and the title of the article is Revival of Musical Review is Subject of Undergrad Referendum, October 23rd. And the article goes on to say that somebody named Robert Hildebrand, was chair of the committee investigating the revival.
Bob was head of the Interfraternity Council at the time.
So do you remember anything about this referendum that he did?
But I'm not surprised because Bob was a sort of a politician type.
Mm-hmm.
And he was in my class and a very active guy, big man on campus type.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was, he probably thought probably heard about it and thought it would be a good idea or something.
So it sounds like you and Jack Kiefer and Bob were kind of the people getting this thing off the ground. It's also interesting in that same article, this is the quote from the article exactly, Hildebrand wishes it to be understood that this is not a revival of the old Tech Show, and for the main part, the content will be different.
Because I think the old Tech shows were review type things, skits and
right.
Not a real musical content.
Okay, but here's the next thing to that point. He says the new review will differ mainly in that it will consist of a series of acts and presentations held together by a master of ceremonies.
Well, that was not what.
But that's not what happened,
no.
And that's the text shows that. Do you remember having conversations about that?
No, I'm surprised.
Because originally they wanted to make it clear that it was not a revival of the Tech Show, and then I forgot which issue of the Tech comes out and says, due to prior what they call misunderstandings, it is a revival of the Tech Show. They obviously at some point there was a decision made that you were actually going to revive the Tech Show, and I just wondered if you had.
Well, I think what we revived was the tradition of having it.
Yeah.
But what it turned out to be was very different from what they.
Well, there were some that were not just reviews. Some of the previous ones, they were actual musical comedies.
They were?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know anything about
yeah.
it.
Right.
Happened before.
Right.
All I knew was it hadn't happened for a while.
Right.
But, I didn't know for how long.
Right. What was really different about the 47 show was the first time it was not an all-male cast. All the previous ones, even the female roles, were played by men.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that was like the Harvard hasty pudding.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there were pictures in the old yearbooks of the female characters, all dressed up in drag and nice portraits, and it's very funny.
Yeah.
Was the issue of the casting, was it just a given that it would just be male and female, or was that even a point of conversation when you were figuring out the cast for the 47 show? Was it just a given that it would be male and female?
Yeah.
It was just a given. Yeah.
But the females were not all from MIT.
Mm-hmm.
I think we got some ringers in from. But Jerry Sapolsky was from MIT.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. The program booklet for the show, which you kindly loaned me, in the credits, it says musical scores, and it mentions two people, Ed Kratoville and Fred Sylvander.
I have no idea.
Were they involved maybe in copying out parts or something?
I have no idea.
I wondered what their...
I don't know. I don't know.
As far as your work with that, did you have any help or any guidance on orchestration and stuff like that?
No, I did all my
Yeah.
own orchestra.
Yeah, because it shows a basic grasp of the tools there, and I just wondered. That's just very astute, and I was really struck by that. The program booklet mentions faculty advisors William Green and Dean Fowler. Do you remember what their involvement might have been as advisors?
I don't know. I don't recall what, if any, involvement.
It might have been that some groups at MIT, they need a faculty advisor in order to do certain things, but those advisors don't do anything.
Yeah.
They're just there.
I don't know. I don't even know if they were given the script to read beforehand. Maybe they did.
Mm-hmm. When you were writing the songs for the show, were there particular models that you kind of had in mind?
Well, as I said, On the Town was very recent imprint.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned how you got interested in writing music for the theater. There's a number of things that you've done. There was incidental music for the Glass Menagerie.
Yeah, this was much later now.
Right.
Now that was the things that I did for the theater. This is when really as a result of my wife getting involved in the theater. She really didn't seriously get involved in the theater until after our second daughter was born, and she got into it. This is when we were living in Concord, and she took a course at the De Cordova with a terrific guy who was a professional theater person.
Do you remember who that was?
Yeah, Jackson Barry is his name. He subsequently ended up on the faculty at the University of Maryland, and in that sort of new town that was built between Baltimore and Washington. But anyway, he was a very good teacher, and he directed this production of the Glass Menagerie, and my wife had the leading role, Amanda. And I noticed in reading, when we were talking about it, that Tennessee Williams called for music, specifically in the script. So I said, I'll do that. And I hadn't, prior to that, I hadn't written anything for the theater at that point. I was just doing the dance stuff before.
Mm-hmm.
And so I read the script and noted very carefully, where the stage directions called for music, very specifically. And that's how I did it, and how I got into it.
Wow.
And having, and I scored it for trumpet, flute, piano, and percussion, and a couple of other instruments I've forgotten. And the reason I scored it for that was, well, first of all, I think he was specific in mentioning a trumpet or something in this, there was a reference to that. And also, one of my friends was a very good flute player. And so I pulled a group together and rehearsed them, and we recorded it. And, that's how it all happened. That was my first attempt, and it was a very successful experience. And I thought it went very well. People were very complimentary about the music. And then, as my wife's involvement in the theater blossomed after that, whenever there was something that either she was involved in directly or that I heard about through her that involved music, I got into, that's how I did. So I wrote a lot of stuff for, and they were all local productions. Most of them were not professional productions. Some of them were. But
So there was Death of a Salesman, The Cherry
Yes.
Orchard,
yeah,
Mr. Acularis.
yeah, the Arcularis was a very wonderful experience, because Conrad Aiken actually came to the performance
My goodness.
and sat in the front row and cried, because it's an autobiographical piece, and it's a horrendous story. He he happened upon his mother and his uncle in flagrante delictu in a boat by a dock when he was a kid, and it was a really major trauma in his life, and this play was about that. So anyway, and sort of the major, the biggest scale thing I did for the theater was in Britain. We were involved with a semi-professional theater called the Questers, and they built a new theater, and Michael Redgrave was sort of honorary chairman of the theater. It was a sort of a off-Broadway semi-professional operation, and they built this new theater, and the Queen Mother was, did I tell you about this? No, she was invited. She came to the opening, and the opening production was Ibsen's Brant, which is one of his epics, like Peer Gynt. It's huge.
Yeah.
And so I wrote a fairly ambitious score for that.
It's
for wind orchestra.
Yeah.
And also has a piece for organ in it, because again, it's specified in the play.
There's even a movement that's just organ in there.
Yeah. Well, this opens third act or something, and we recorded it with a professional organist at some church in the city of London, and we recorded it at midnight so there wouldn't be any traffic noises.
Wow, did I miss it? The name of the theater, that theater company?
Questers.
The Questers. Okay.
Questro.
Okay. Yeah, that piece. It looks like one of your really big, kind of ambitious pieces, and some really good writing in there.
Yeah. Well. So. We had some very good musicians, and it was we had the luxury of professional quality people.
Fantastic.
Because most of the time, we had to sort of make do with what we could get together.
So you could also write more ambitious music there too, and
yeah.
that shows in the score there too. And I wondered about that. When you're writing incidental music, were there certain kind of guiding ideas you had about what you were trying to do with the music?
Well, the guiding all came from the play. I mean, what's going on and what the music had. All of the things that I wrote for the theater were specified in the script by the author. I mean, like, for example, in The Cherry Orchard, Chekhov actually has this whole act with this Jewish orchestra playing in the off stage, and the characters are coming in and out of this ballroom where this Jewish orchestra is playing and off stage, and so that's pretty clear. And in the Arcularis thing, a lot of the play takes place on a ship, mysterious kind of ship. It's not clear whether it's real or phantom or what, but the notion of a ship's orchestra sort of informed that, and I scored it for mostly string quartet.
And
I don't remember. But so the cues all came from the playwright, because the music was functional and specified by the Japanese no plays that I wrote, by Yukio Mishima. Again, the score was suggested by traditional Japanese classical, the flute and drum and a couple of other weird things. So that's what I did.
So we had spoken a little bit ago about your music for dance, and you had worked with Martha Baird, who had a group called Dance Makers, and apparently this was, at least in one of the programs that you loaned me, said it was the first professional modern dance company in New England. And so you got to know Martha Baird through, what's her name?
Carolee Martin.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you know much about Martha Baird, kind of her background? I did some initial research, and I wasn't finding much about her. Do you know kind of much about her background?
I really don't remember too much about it. I mean, she was. There was a kind of an association of, there still is, of modern dance people who there used to be studios in Green Street in Cambridge.
Right.
And that's where they kind of congregated. And there was this kind of informal society of people who were really seriously into modern dance. And Martha was one of them. She was one of the founders of this group. And her company kind of came out of that group. But I don't remember much about her background. But
so it was this performance at Sanders Theater at Harvard University on July 13th, 1960. They did a dance to your piece called Thixotrophy.
Right.
Can you explain that title?
Oh, yeah. That's from my chemical engineering. That's from my colloidal chemistry days. A thixotropic substance is a colloidal mix, which is solid, apparently solid, but when you step on it, it becomes fluid. And the most common example of that is mud at the seashore. Where the sand is apparently solid, but you step on it and it squishes. Well, that's thixotropic. That's a thixotropic gel. And certain clays are thixotropic because of the particle size. And they remain in suspension, surrounded by fluid. But that's a evocative dance idea.
Absolutely. When you were working with the choreographer Caroline Martin, what was that collaboration like? Did you write the music first? And
No. We talked about it. I mean, she said what kind of a movement she thought she wanted to do next, and we sort of. I mean, it was really a very active collaboration. It wasn't. It was to and fro.
Wow. The program for that concert lists only 2 musicians, but that piece, at least according to your score, is for trumpet, trombone, piano, bass, and percussion.
Right.
Do you remember who the other musicians were?
Well, I was a pianist. No, I don't. I don't remember where I got people from, but I had to find them.
Yeah.
And usually, what had happened, I think I found one, and then that one. I try to get people, from the conservatory or that sort of, people who had some reasonable proficiency.
Right.
And usually I found one, and they helped me find the others.
The only other musician listed in the program book was someone named Masa Fakui. There was a percussion piece on the program. It just and I wonder if that person maybe did solo percussion piece. I just was wondering.
It may not have been the one that was did my piece.
Well, I mean, they mentioned the same program mentions this fixed atrophy, but it didn't list the other musicians, and so that's why I was asking. Dance Makers also did another piece of yours, January 14th, 1961, and the title in the program says "Dance or Design for Seven." Is that the name of the dance and the piece, or do you remember what music you used for that?
No, I don't remember that at all. That's very odd. Yeah, I don't remember. I'm amazed. I don't know.
Were there some other collaborations that you did that there just aren't programs that I've seen, other dance pieces?
Well, it's Leaving Behind Him, I mentioned.
That's right.
Yeah. That was a fairly extended piece. I was, like, I don't know, 10 or 15 minute piece.
And you said that was with cello and piano?
Piano and cello, yeah.
Who was the cellist for that?
I don't remember. Somebody I found.
Wow.
It was me on the piano.
Wow.
I mean, another the music I wrote for View from the Bridge was for oboe and piano, and the oboist was the number 2 guy at Polaroid, who happened to be an very good amateur oboist, and I sort of seduced him into performing the thing, which he did, and it was very good.
Wow.
Sorry.
As another example of another engineer scientist who happens to be a good musician. They seem to be around. And
well, I used to work at Polaroid.
That's right.
So I knew him.
He
was an interesting guy. And he lived in Lincoln, so, he was a natural.
Wow. Were there other musicians you remember working at Polaroid at the time?
No, nobody that stands out in my mind, but I'm sure there were.
Talking about some of your other music, there's a concertino for piano and orchestra.
Well, I never finished it. That's an unfinished piece.
It's unfinished.
That was.
But there's a piano concerto in 3 movements.
That's a very early kid piece. That was when I was still into my Rachmaninoff period.
It really shows. Did you by chance ever get a chance to play it with an orchestra or even a run through? No.
It's really kind of just for fun.
So this Prelude and Allegro for Orchestra, which was performed by the Boston Civic Symphony Orchestra, April 7th, 1951, how did that come about that they did your piece?
God, I don't remember how. I just looked into it, I guess. That's when I was flailing about trying to find people who might be interested in performing my stuff. This is when I also saw Lucas Foss. And I think I, met with the conductor and gave him my pitch, and I guess he said, "Show me something," or something. I think that's how it happened. But it was like being a salesman.
Yeah, absolutely.
I hated it.
Yeah, that's a hard part of that. Because you would just want to.
And that's really. It was after that experience that kind of convinced me that to forget about that route as a way of getting to hear my stuff performed, because I knew it was so unlikely. The chances were so low. That it was not worth the effort. So that's when I sort of shifted gears and started writing small scale stuff for theater and dance and here.
Right. Some of your solo piano music, have you played that on recitals and stuff like that?
Actually, very very little. the only thing I did was a four-handed piece called Prisms, which I did play in front of other people.
Mm-hmm. When did you write the Petite Suite? That looks kind of interesting.
That was also pretty early.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Maybe I should give a look at that.
Yeah.
Include it on my...
Yeah.
No, that's pretty early stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So over the years, you've been giving recitals and stuff, and there's some. I heard of your performance a year ago here at MIT, and how often are you playing currently these days?
No, about once a year. I mean, it takes me that long to sort of put together something that's a reasonable quality.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm having a hell of a time with these Shostakovich preludes, which I'm working on.
Those are great.
I mean, they're wonderful
Yeah.
pieces. And they're not that difficult technically, but they're very difficult to remember, where he's going from measure to measure. It's getting into his head as to, and then remembering it is hard.
Are you working on learning the whole cycle?
Well, I'm doing about half of them. I'm doing about half the Chopin ones.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
but I thought that would be kind of an interesting program.
Wow. When do you think that might be?
Well, toward the end of the year.
I definitely want to be there. I missed your performance earlier this year. I was sorry about that.
Yeah.
What are some other pieces that you'd like to learn in the coming years?
I don't know. I don't really. I just focus on the ones currently, and then when I finish that program, then I start thinking about what I might want to do next.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, are there any concluding remarks you want to make about music at MIT, or if there's some subject that I haven't asked you about that you think is I should know about?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I found it a very kind of fun thing to do at MIT. The Glee Club stuff was very congenial, and particularly loved the touring. We went on tour and we sang with women's colleges, and then we did one great thing we did was the creation, Haydn's Creation, and Jordan Hall we did that.
Yeah, wow.
And I had a great timpani part, which I played.
That's right. In the big overture, there's a nice timpani part in there. Yeah.
And so that was just a lot of fun, the Glee Club stuff. And so was the orchestra. The orchestra stuff, I don't remember that we performed a lot.
It looks like about twice a year, according to the
there
tech.
were few performances, but lots of rehearsals. And again, it was a very nice kind of social experience too, because a lot of people in the orchestra were people that I saw a lot of. Not a lot, but several of the people in the orchestra were friends of mine anyway. And I had one very funny story, which you'll be amused at. One of my friends at the time was a physicist named Don Smith, who was quite a good violinist, and he was in the orchestra. And he also had a string quartet, which he played in regularly. But he was a serious physicist. And after we both left MIT, I got a call. This was during the McCarthy period. I got a call from on the telephone. This was shortly after we were married, in the early 50s. And it says, "This is so and so from the FBI." And I think my wife answered the phone, and she said, "Oh, you must be joking." I was like, you know, come off it. She, no, he said, this is for real, and we have you listed as a reference from Don Smith, who was applying for a job with the Nuclear Energy Commission or something, and we're doing his clearance. And so, when can I come and talk to you? So we ran around the house and hiding all the incriminating literature, any incriminating literature. And it turned out, I mean, this guy was, Don was from New Mexico, and an all-American boy type guy, very innocent politically. And the people he gave as references were members of his string quartet and me. Well, it turned out that I think a couple of the string quartet members were politically suspect in terms of their membership in various organizations. And so he had a lot of trouble getting his clearance. But I thought you'd find that kind of funny.
Wow. Well, the McCarthy era certainly had a devastating effect on MIT.
Yeah. Anyway.
Wow. Well, I want to thank you very much for your generosity and sharing your thoughts and memories and observations. This has been really, really good.
Oh, wow.
So
I enjoyed doing it.
Thank you very much.
So